The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing Margaret Ashwick's gaunt silhouette against the amber glow of dying candlelight. Her weathered hands trembled on the iron handle as November rain lashed the crumbling stone facade behind Dr. Edmund Holloway. He stood on the threshold clutching his leather medical bag against his chest like a shield, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto the rotting porch boards. "Doctor," Margaret whispered, her sunken eyes boring into him with desperate hunger. "They're dying again." Edmund stepped across the threshold into air thick with the smell of decay and something else, something sweet and wrong that made his stomach lurch. The Ashwick estate had always been a monument to grief, but tonight it felt like a tomb preparing to receive new occupants. Shadows danced in the corners where candlelight couldn't reach, and the wallpaper peeled in long strips that rustled with each gust of wind through broken window panes. "Where are they?" Edmund asked, setting his bag down in the entrance hall. His voice echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off walls lined with portraits of dead Ashwicks whose painted eyes seemed to track his movement. "Upstairs. Separate rooms." Margaret's voice cracked as she led him toward the grand staircase. "Just like before. Just like it always happens." The wooden steps creaked under their weight, each groan a note in some funeral dirge. Edmund had delivered babies in hovels and tended plague victims in their death throes, but something about this house made his physician's composure waver. The very air seemed to press against him, thick with centuries of sorrow. "Tell me exactly what you observed," he said as they climbed. Margaret paused on the landing, her bony fingers gripping the banister until her knuckles went white. "It started 3 days ago." Samuel complained his head hurt. Then Thomas, in his room across the hall, began screaming about the same pain. Neither boy had spoken to the other that morning. They walked down a corridor lined with doors, most of them sealed shut. Edmund noticed scratch marks on several, as if desperate fingernails had clawed at the wood from the inside. "At first I thought it was merely the bond between twins," Margaret continued. "But then they both collapsed at the exact same moment. Samuel in the garden, Thomas in the library. Both fell as if struck by the same invisible hand." She stopped before 2 doors facing each other across the narrow hallway. Even through the thick wood, Edmund could hear labored breathing from both rooms, perfectly synchronized. "They haven't spoken since. Haven't opened their eyes. But every 13 minutes. Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Every 13 minutes, they convulse together. As if the same demon seizes them both." Edmund approached the first door, pressing his ear to the wood. The breathing inside was shallow, irregular, punctuated by small whimpers of pain. He checked his pocket watch, 12 minutes since Margaret had mentioned the last episode. "How long has your family lived in this house?" he asked, though something told him he already dreaded the answer. "Since my great-grandfather Jeremiah fled Salem in 1692. He and his twin brother Ezra built this place with their own hands, stone by stone." Margaret's eyes grew distant. "They said the twins were different from other children. That they shared thoughts, dreams, even pain. The villagers called it witchcraft." 1 minute remaining on his watch. Edmund opened the first door to find 7-year-old Samuel lying motionless on a narrow bed. The boy's skin was pale as winter moonlight, his small chest rising and falling in rapid, desperate gasps. Dark circles ringed his closed eyes, and his lips moved silently as if he were trying to speak to someone only he could hear. "Samuel," Edmund whispered, approaching the bed. The boy showed no response, but his breathing grew more agitated. 30 seconds. Edmund crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, letting in what little daylight penetrated the storm clouds. In the gray light, he could see that Samuel's fingernails were bloody, as if he'd been clawing at something invisible. 15 seconds. "Doctor," Margaret breathed from the doorway. "It's time." The convulsion struck like lightning. Samuel's small body arched off the bed, his back bending at an impossible angle while his limbs thrashed with violent spasms. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, tendons standing out in his neck like bowstrings. The episode lasted exactly 1 minute before he collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping. From across the hall came the sound of identical thrashing, perfectly synchronized down to the second. Edmund rushed to the opposite room where Thomas lay in the same death-pale condition as his brother. The boy's convulsion was ending just as Samuel's had, leaving him panting and motionless on sweat-soaked sheets. "This has happened before," Edmund said, not quite a question. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. 21 years ago. My sons, David and Daniel. They were 7 years old when it started, just like Samuel and Thomas now. For 3 days they suffered these fits, growing weaker with each episode. On the third night, she couldn't finish. They died. Together. At the exact same moment. David in this room, Daniel across the hall. The doctor said their hearts simply stopped, but I heard them in those final seconds. Her voice broke completely. They were screaming the same words, though neither could have heard the other through these thick walls. Edmund felt ice forming in his chest. What words? He's pulling me down. Over and over, until their voices gave out. Margaret gripped his arm with surprising strength. Doctor, I've seen this curse claim 3 generations of Ashwick twins. My husband and his brother in 1786. My father-in-law and his twin in 1765. Always the same age, always the same symptoms, always on the same November night. As if summoned by her words, a low rumble seemed to emanate from somewhere deep beneath the house. The floorboards vibrated under their feet, and both boys stirred restlessly in their beds. There's something else, Margaret whispered, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. Something I've never told another living soul. Edmund waited, though every instinct screamed at him to flee this cursed place. The night my sons died, I saw them. Walking together in the garden, hand in hand, while their bodies lay dying upstairs. They looked at me through the window and smiled, but their eyes were black as winter nights. And behind them. She shuddered. Behind them walked a shadow in the shape of a man, leading them towards something I couldn't see. The rumbling from below grew stronger, and Edmund noticed that the family portraits on the walls seemed to flicker in the candlelight, their subjects' expressions shifting from sorrow to something that looked almost like hunger. Doctor, Margaret pleaded, you're Samuel and Thomas's only hope. If there's any way to break this curse, to save them from whatever claimed their fathers and grandfathers, you must find it. I cannot bear to bury another generation of my blood. Edmund looked at his pocket watch. 11 minutes until the next convulsion. In the gathering darkness of the November storm, he realized he was standing at the threshold of something far more terrible than disease, something that had been feeding on this family's bloodline for over a century. The question that haunted him as he prepared to examine the boys more thoroughly was not whether he could save them, but whether anyone who entered this house during the curse's awakening would be allowed to leave unchanged. Have you ever felt a connection so deep with someone that their pain became your own? Dawn brought no relief to the Ashwick estate. If anything, the gray morning light made the house's decay more visible, revealing water stains that looked like weeping faces and wallpaper patterns that seemed to writhe when observed from the corner of one's eye. Edmund had spent the night in the library, surrounded by generations of family records, medical texts, and something far more disturbing, the Ashwick family's collection of death certificates. Every twin death followed the same pattern. 3 days of synchronized convulsions, growing weaker with each episode, until their hearts stopped beating at the exact same moment. No medical explanation. No sign of poison or disease. Just death arriving like a harvest moon, inevitable and precise. You haven't slept, Margaret observed, entering the library with a tray of breakfast that neither of them would touch. Sleep seems irrelevant when children are dying, Edmund replied, not looking up from a leather-bound journal dated 1765. Tell me about Jeremiah and Ezra Ashwick. The first twins. Margaret settled into a chair across from him, her movements careful and deliberate like someone navigating a minefield of memories. They were accused of witchcraft in Salem, along with their mother. She was hanged, but the boys escaped during the chaos. Some say they had help from something that wasn't human. What kind of help? The kind that comes with a price. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Village rumors claimed they made a bargain to escape the witch hunters. That they traded something precious for the power to disappear into the Maine wilderness. Edmund found a passage in the journal that made his blood run cold. Written in fading ink, a previous generation's desperate scrawl, the entity grows stronger with each harvest. It speaks through the children in their final moments, using voices that sound like our beloved dead. Margaret, he said slowly, when your sons died, did they speak in their own voices? The widow's face went ashen. No. David spoke with his grandfather's voice, though the man had been dead for 30 years. And Daniel. She pressed her hands to her mouth as if to hold back the words. Daniel spoke with his grandmother's voice, calling to me in perfect mimicry of her accent and mannerisms. A chill ran down Edmund's spine as he realized the full horror of what they were facing. This wasn't simply a family curse, it was something that fed on familial bonds, using the voices of the dead to torment the living during their children's final moments. I need to speak with Reverend Blackwood, he announced, closing the journal. Surely the church has records of what happened in Salem, of the accusations against your ancestors. The Reverend won't speak of such things willingly. He fears what mentioning the old stories might awaken. Margaret stood and walked to the window, staring out at the family cemetery where weathered headstones marked generations of twin graves. But if you insist on pursuing this path, you'll find him at the church. Though I warn you, some knowledge carries its own curse. The walk to Salem Village's modest church provided Edmund with his first clear view of the Ashwick property in daylight. The estate sat on a hill overlooking the surrounding farmland, its foundation built into what appeared to be natural rock formations. But as he studied the stonework more carefully, he realized the rocks weren't natural at all, they were arranged in specific patterns, symbols carved into their faces that hurt to look at directly. Reverend Blackwood was a thin man in his 60s, with prematurely white hair and eyes that darted nervously when Edmund mentioned the Ashwick name. I don't discuss the old accusations, he said immediately, continuing to arrange hymnals on the pews as if staying busy could ward off unwanted conversation. Children are dying, Reverend. Whatever happened in 1692 is still happening now. Blackwood's hands stilled on the books. You're the physician Margaret summoned. I am. And unless I understand what I'm truly fighting, those boys will be dead by tomorrow night. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Finally, Blackwood walked to the altar and retrieved a small wooden box from beneath the communion table. These are the original testimonies from the Salem trials, he said reluctantly. I should have burned them years ago, but... He opened the box to reveal yellowed papers covered in cramped handwriting. But some records are too important to destroy, no matter how terrible their contents. Edmund examined the documents with growing horror. Witness after witness described Jeremiah and Ezra Ashwick as children who shared impossible connections, finishing each other's thoughts, experiencing identical injuries when separated by miles, and most disturbing of all, speaking simultaneously in voices that belonged to dead villagers. Look at this testimony, Blackwood said, pointing to a particular passage. Mary Corwin swore that she saw the Ashwick twins standing in her garden at midnight, holding hands and speaking in her dead husband's voice. But other witnesses placed the boys in completely different locations at the same time. Impossible. Unless they weren't entirely human anymore. The Reverend's voice carried the weight of decades spent trying to rationalize the irrational. The final testimony came from their own mother, given just before her execution. She confessed that her sons had made contact with something ancient, something that promised to save them from the hangman's noose in exchange for. In exchange for what? The souls of every twin born to their bloodline, delivered in perfectly synchronized deaths that would feed whatever entity had granted them their escape. Edmund felt the world tilt around him. You're saying that Jeremiah and Ezra sold their descendants' lives to save their own? I'm saying that some bargains echo through generations like stones thrown into still water. And the ripples are still spreading. Blackwood carefully returned the documents to their box. Doctor, if you truly intend to fight this curse, you need to understand that you're not dealing with a medical condition. You're facing something that has been patiently collecting its payment for over a century. The walk back to the Ashwick estate felt longer than before, as if the very ground was reluctant to carry him toward whatever waited in that house. Storm clouds gathered overhead, and Edmund noticed that birds fell silent whenever he approached the property line. Inside, he found Margaret sitting beside Samuel's bed, holding the boy's limp hand while tears streamed down her face. "How long since the last episode?" he asked. 6 minutes. Her voice was hollow with exhaustion. "Doctor, they're getting weaker. I can feel their life slipping away with each convulsion." Edmund checked Thomas across the hall and found the same deterioration. Both boys were pale as corpses, their breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Whatever was consuming them was accelerating its harvest. "Margaret, I need you to tell me everything about the house's construction. Every detail about how your ancestors built this place." "They built it over the old foundation," she said mechanically. "Jeremiah claimed he'd found the perfect spot, where the earth itself would protect them from their enemies. But what?" Her grip tightened on Samuel's hand. "But the foundation stones weren't quarried from any local source. They appeared overnight, arranged in patterns that no Christian man should know. And beneath them. Beneath them what, Margaret? Beneath them lies something that was old when the world was young. Something that whispered promises to two terrified boys and has been collecting its payment ever since." As if responding to her words, both boys suddenly opened their eyes, but the eyes that stared back at Edmund weren't the innocent gaze of 7-year-olds. They were ancient, hungry, and filled with an intelligence that had been waiting over a century for this moment. "Hello, Doctor," both boys said in perfect unison, though their voices carried the weight of something infinitely older and more terrible than children should possess. "We've been expecting you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Both boys stared at Edmund with eyes that reflected depths no child should possess, their synchronized breathing the only sound in the suddenly airless rooms. "Samuel. Thomas." Margaret whispered, but Edmund placed a restraining hand on her arm. "That's not them speaking," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the boys. "Is it?" The twin smiles that spread across their pale faces were identical and terrible. "Clever physician," they said in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the house. "But not clever enough to leave when you still could." Edmund forced himself to approach Samuel's bed. The boy's body remained motionless, but his eyes tracked the doctor's movement with predatory awareness. "What are you?" Edmund asked. "We are the fulfillment of an ancient promise," both boys replied. "We are the price paid by desperate children who thought they could cheat death itself." Margaret pressed herself against the doorframe as if trying to become invisible. "Please," she begged. "Please give me back my grandsons." The thing speaking through the boys laughed, a sound like wind through cemetery gates. "Your grandsons belong to us now, just as their fathers did, and their fathers before them. The blood debt must be paid." "What blood debt?" Edmund demanded, though part of him already suspected the answer. In 1692, when the Salem hunters came with their ropes and pyres, Jeremiah and Ezra Ashwick knelt in the cellar of their burning home and called upon powers older than their Christian God. They offered us their bloodline in exchange for escape, every twin born to their descendants, delivered to us when they reached the age of perfect innocence. The boys' heads turned in perfect synchronization to stare at Margaret. 7 years old. Old enough to feel fear, young enough for their souls to burn bright and clean. Edmund felt nausea rise in his throat. You've been murdering children for over a century. We've been collecting what was freely given, they corrected. Each generation of twins strengthens our hold on this realm. With every synchronized death, we grow closer to breaking free from the prison their ancestors built around us. Prison. The binding symbols carved into this house's foundation. Jeremiah and Ezra were clever boys, they made their bargain, but they also tried to contain what they had summoned. For generations, we have been trapped here, able to claim only what was promised, nothing more. Edmund's mind raced through the implications. But something's different this time. The boy's smiles widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for children's mouths. This time, we have help from the living. This time, someone stands ready to complete the ritual that will shatter our chains forever. Both boys turned their terrible gaze toward Margaret, who shrank back against the wall with a cry of denial. "No," she whispered. "No, I would never." "Wouldn't you?" they asked mockingly. "Haven't you already? The moment you invited the good doctor into this house, you set the final piece in motion. His presence here, his connection to the boys through his efforts to heal them, it creates the perfect conduit for our escape." Edmund felt ice spreading through his veins. "What do you mean?" Every physician who has ever tried to save the Ashwick twins becomes bound to their fate. Your predecessor, Dr. Whitmore, thought he could break the curse when David and Daniel were dying. Instead, he became our first recruit among the living. Margaret's face went white as parchment. "Whitmore went mad after my sons died. He spent his final years talking to voices no one else could hear. He spent his final years serving us," the boys corrected. Preparing the way for this moment, when a new doctor would arrive to play his part in our liberation. The temperature in both rooms plummeted suddenly, and frost began forming on the windows despite the November warmth outside. Edmund watched in horror as shadows seemed to pour from the walls themselves, taking vague human shapes that pressed close around the children's beds. "Show him," both boys commanded, and the shadows shifted to reveal faces, generations of dead Ashwicks, their expressions twisted with eternal agony. "Every twin we've claimed," they explained as the ghostly procession circled the rooms. "Every soul we've harvested to fuel our growing power. They're all here, Doctor. All waiting for the moment when their sacrifice finally purchases our freedom." Edmund recognized some of the faces from the family portraits downstairs, David and Daniel, looking exactly as they had at 7 years old, their mouths open in soundless screams. Behind them came older twins, their clothing marking them from different eras, but all bearing the same expression of desperate terror. "The ritual is nearly complete," the boys continued. 3 days of synchronized suffering to weaken the barriers between realms. Tomorrow night, when Samuel and Thomas draw their final breaths together, the binding will shatter. We will be free to claim not just the Ashwick bloodline, but every twin born under this cursed sky. "I won't let that happen," Edmund said, though his voice shook with the effort. "You have no choice in the matter. The moment you entered this house, you became part of the ritual. Your compassion, your desperate desire to heal, it feeds us just as surely as the children's fear." The boys sat up in their beds simultaneously, their movements jerky like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "But we are not without mercy, Doctor. Serve us willingly, and we will grant you the same immortality we gave Dr. Whitmore." "What happened to Whitmore?" Margaret answered in a broken whisper. "He's still alive, Doctor. After 60 years, he's still alive. I see him sometimes, walking through the woods around the estate, talking to things that aren't there. His body never ages, but his mind. She shuddered. His mind belongs to whatever lives beneath this house. The boys laughed again, that terrible sound that seemed to echo from dimensions where laughter meant something else entirely. Choose quickly, Doctor, they said. Tomorrow night, when the final convulsion takes these vessels, you will either stand with us as our willing servant, or join the Ashwick twins in their eternal torment. As if to emphasize their words, both Samuel and Thomas began convulsing again, their small bodies arching off their beds while their mouths opened in synchronized screams that sounded like every dying child who had ever called for their mother in the dark. Edmund watched helplessly as the fit continued for exactly 1 minute before leaving the boys gasping and still. But this time, when the convulsions ended, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Both children were smiling. The house itself began to change as the second night fell over the Ashwick estate. What had been merely decay and neglect transformed into something actively malevolent, walls bleeding tears of black ichor, floorboards creaking in rhythms that matched no human heartbeat, and mirrors reflecting rooms that couldn't exist in any earthly dwelling. Edmund found no rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the procession of dead twins circling the boys' beds, their silent screams echoing in his mind. He paced the library through the long hours, reading accounts of demonic manifestations and binding rituals while the house groaned around him like a living thing in pain. At 3 a.m, Margaret's scream shattered the oppressive quiet. Edmund raced upstairs to find her standing in the hallway between the boys' rooms, her face slack with terror. Both doors had swung open on their own, revealing a sight that defied every law of nature he understood. Samuel and Thomas were floating 3 feet above their beds, their bodies rigid as carved effigies while their nightgowns fluttered in an impossible wind. Their eyes had rolled back to show only white, and their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization. "How long have they been like this?" Edmund whispered. "I don't know. I heard chanting and came to check." Margaret's voice broke as the boys' chanting grew louder, the ancient syllables seeming to make the very air thicken around them. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath began misting. Edmund watched in fascination and horror as frost spread across the walls in geometric patterns that resembled the symbols he'd seen carved into the house's foundation. They're completing the summoning, he realized. Each night brings them closer to full manifestation. As if responding to his words, both boys turned their heads toward him with movements too sharp and quick for human necks. When they spoke, their voices carried the weight of something vast and ancient stirring in the depths below. "The barriers weaken, Doctor. Can you feel our true form pressing against the boundaries of this realm?" Edmund could feel it, a presence so massive and alien that his mind struggled to comprehend its edges. It was like standing at the shore of an ocean and trying to grasp the full depth of water stretching beyond the horizon. "Tomorrow night will see our emergence," the boys continued. "But tonight, we offer you one final demonstration of what awaits those who oppose us." The chanting resumed, but now the words seemed to come from every surface in the house. The wallpaper whispered ancient syllables, the floorboards groaned them in creaking wood song, and the very foundations rumbled with harmonics that made Edmund's bones ache. Margaret grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "The cellar," she gasped. "Something's happening in the cellar." They could hear it now, a sound like massive stones grinding against each other, as if the earth itself was shifting to accommodate something pushing up from below. The house shuddered with each grinding note, and plaster rained from the ceiling in steady streams. "We have to get them out of here," Edmund said, but when he moved toward Samuel's bed, an invisible force slammed him backward against the wall with enough power to drive the breath from his lungs. "You cannot interfere with the awakening," both boys said without breaking their chant. "But you may witness the glory of our true nature." The grinding from below grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like massive chains snapping one by one. Each broken link sent tremors through the house that rattled windows and toppled furniture. "The binding weakens," Margaret whispered, her face pale as moonlight. "God help us, it's breaking free." Through the frosted windows, Edmund could see lights appearing in the surrounding forest, not the warm glow of lanterns, but cold, blue illumination that seemed to leach color from everything it touched. The lights moved in formation, circling the house like predators preparing to close in on wounded prey. "Dr. Whitmore," Margaret breathed. "He's calling the others." "Others?" "Everyone who ever tried to fight the curse and failed. Everyone who became its servant instead." Her grip on his arm tightened. "Doctor, we need to find the original binding contract. It's the only thing that might tell us how to strengthen the prison instead of breaking it." "Where would such a document be kept?" "The family crypt. Beneath the house, where Jeremiah and Ezra first made their bargain." The boys' laughter filled both rooms, a sound like breaking glass in a cathedral. "By all means, visit our domain," they said. "See where your precious ritual was born, and where it will reach its glorious conclusion tomorrow night." Edmund looked at Margaret's desperate face and made his decision. Whatever waited in the cellar beneath the Ashwick estate, it couldn't be worse than watching helplessly while these children were consumed by forces beyond human comprehension. "Show me," he said. Margaret led him through passages he hadn't known existed, past rooms sealed with iron bars and doors marked with symbols that made his eyes water to look upon. The temperature dropped with each step downward, until their breath came in thick white clouds that seemed to take on shapes of their own in the flickering candlelight. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door bound with iron straps. Margaret produced an ancient key from beneath her dress, her hands shaking as she turned it in the lock. "This key has passed from mother to daughter for 6 generations," she said. Each keeper hoped she would be the last to use it. The door swung open to reveal a chamber carved directly from living rock. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for human vision to process comfortably. At the center of the room stood a stone altar stained dark with something that might once have been blood. But it was what surrounded the altar that made Edmund's sanity real. Dozens of iron coffins lined the walls, each one sized for a child. Most were sealed, but several stood open, revealing the perfectly preserved bodies of twin children who had died decades or centuries ago. They lay with their hands clasped together, their faces peaceful in eternal sleep. "Every generation," Margaret whispered. "We couldn't bear to bury them in the regular cemetery, knowing what had claimed them. So we brought them here, to rest together in the place where their fate was sealed." Edmund approached the altar and found what they had come seeking, a document written on parchment that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. The words were inscribed in what looked like dried blood, and they seemed to writhe and shift when he tried to read them directly. "It's written in multiple languages," he realized. "Latin, Hebrew, and something else, something older." "Can you read it?" Edmund studied the text carefully, his knowledge of ancient languages strained to its limits. Slowly, horribly, the meaning became clear. "It's not just a contract," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a breeding program. The entity didn't just want the Ashwick twins, it wanted to create specific bloodlines, families whose children would be born with the exact spiritual resonance needed to serve as vessels for its manifestation." Margaret sank to her knees beside the altar. "You're saying my entire family line exists only to feed this thing?" "I'm saying your ancestors were tricked into believing they were making a simple bargain for their lives. Instead, they signed the death warrants for every twin who would ever be born to their bloodline." Edmund continued reading, his horror growing with each revelation. "But there's more. The entity has been using each generation's deaths to gradually weaken the barriers between dimensions. Samuel and Thomas aren't just another sacrifice, they're the final key that will unlock its prison completely. Above them, The boys' chanting reached a crescendo that made the stones of the crypt vibrate like struck bells. Several of the open coffins began to glow with the same cold light they had seen in the forest, and Edmund realized with dawning terror that the preserved children were beginning to stir. "It's not just claiming Samuel and Thomas," he said, backing toward the door. "It's awakening every twin it has ever harvested." The first of the preserved children sat up in its coffin, turning eyeless sockets toward them while its mouth opened in a soundless scream that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Margaret grabbed the cursed contract from the altar as more of the dead children began to rise. "If this thing is using the twins as vessels," she said desperately, "then maybe breaking their connection to each other will disrupt the ritual. Or maybe it will just give the entity direct access to their souls without any remaining barriers," Edmund replied as they fled up the stairs with the sounds of small feet following behind them. But as they reached the main floor, he realized Margaret might be right about one thing: the connection between Samuel and Thomas was the key to everything. The question was whether severing that bond would save them or damn them all. If you could save two innocent children but damn yourself in the process, would you make that sacrifice? Dawn brought no relief on the third day. If anything, the approaching sunrise seemed to make the house's supernatural manifestations more violent, as if the entity sensed that its moment of triumph was finally at hand. Every mirror in the house now reflected the cellar crypt instead of the rooms they hung in, showing the army of awakened twin children standing in perfect formation around the blood-stained altar. Edmund had spent the remaining hours of darkness studying the cursed contract and every medical text in his possession, searching for some way to sever the psychic connection between Samuel and Thomas without killing them in the process. The solution he had found filled him with dread, but it was their only hope. "You want to do what?" Margaret asked when he explained his plan. "Enter their shared consciousness directly," Edmund repeated, laying out the herbs and instruments he would need. "If the entity is using their psychic bond as a gateway into our realm, then I need to attack that connection from the inside. And how exactly does one enter another person's consciousness?" Edmund held up a vial of liquid that seemed to shift colors in the candlelight. "Combinations of medicinal compounds that can induce temporary death-like states, paired with techniques I found described in some of the more esoteric texts in your family's collection." Margaret stared at the vial with obvious terror. "You're talking about deliberately poisoning yourself." "I'm talking about temporarily severing my own connection to the physical realm so I can follow the link between the boys into whatever dimension their minds currently inhabit." Edmund's hands shook slightly as he spoke. "It's the only way to reach them before tonight's final ritual. And if you can't find your way back, then you'll have 3 bodies to bury instead of 2. The sounds from upstairs had grown more intense throughout the morning. Both boys were now speaking continuously in the ancient tongue, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made the house's structure groan with strain. Every few minutes, objects would fly through the air as if hurled by invisible hands, and the temperature fluctuated wildly between freezing cold and oppressive heat. "There's something else," Edmund said reluctantly. "Something I discovered in the contract that you need to know." Margaret's face was already so pale that he wasn't sure it could get any whiter, but somehow it managed. "The entity hasn't just been collecting twin souls," he continued. "It's been storing them, keeping them conscious and aware, using their combined spiritual energy to fuel its gradual escape from the binding. Every child it has claimed over the past century is still alive in some form, trapped in whatever realm the creature inhabits." "You're saying David and Daniel are still suffering? Still aware?" "I'm saying that if I can reach Samuel and Thomas before the final ritual, I might be able to reach all of them." "But Margaret," he gripped her shoulders firmly. "If something goes wrong, if I don't return by sunset, you have to burn this house to the ground. It's the only way to disrupt the ritual completely. I can't do that with you and the boys still inside. You can and you will. Because if that thing breaks free completely, it won't stop with the Ashwick bloodline. It will spread across New England like a plague, claiming every twin born under its influence until it has enough power to manifest permanently in our world. Margaret nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her weathered face. How long will you need? I don't know. Time moves differently in spiritual realms. I could be gone for minutes or hours from your perspective. Edmund prepared the ritual in the library, arranging candles in the same geometric patterns he had seen carved into the house's foundation. The irony wasn't lost on him, he was using the entity's own symbols to fight against it, hoping that the binding magic would work in reverse. He drank the poisonous mixture in 3 measured doses, feeling his heartbeat slow dramatically with each swallow. The world began to fade around the edges, colors bleeding away until everything appeared in shades of gray and black. Remember, he told Margaret through lips that were already growing numb, if the house starts to collapse, if you see lights coming from the cellar, don't wait for me. Just run. The final dose sent him spiraling into darkness that felt like falling through cold water. His last conscious thought was a prayer that he would find the strength to save children he had never even spoken to in their normal state. When awareness returned, Edmund found himself standing in a vast gray wasteland under a sky the color of old bone. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by twisted trees that looked like they had been grown from human bones. In the distance, he could see a structure that hurt to look at directly, angles that folded in on themselves, walls that existed in too many dimensions at once. You shouldn't have come here, Doctor. Edmund turned to find Samuel and Thomas standing behind him, but they looked wrong in this place. Their bodies flickered between their normal 7-year-old forms and something much older, much more aware. Their eyes held the accumulated wisdom and suffering of all the twins who had been claimed before them. We tried to warn you, Thomas said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We tried to make you leave before it was too late. The entity has been speaking through you since the first day, Edmund realized. But you've been fighting it, haven't you? Trying to break through its control. Samuel nodded sadly. We can feel all of them, Doctor. Every twin who came before us. They're all trapped in there. He pointed toward the impossible structure in the distance. It feeds on our connections to each other, our love and shared experiences. The stronger the bond, the more power it can harvest. That's why it only claims twins, Edmund understood. The psychic connection provides a direct conduit to the spiritual realm. And now it's almost strong enough to manifest completely in your world, Thomas added. When our bodies die tonight, the barrier will shatter permanently. Edmund studied the nightmare landscape around them, noting how it seemed to pulse with malevolent life. How do I sever your connection without killing you both? The boys exchanged a look that held far too much knowledge for children their age. You can't, Samuel said simply. Not from here. The entity has woven itself too deeply into our bond. But, Thomas continued, we might be able to sever the connection ourselves if we had help reaching the others. What others? All the twins trapped in its prison. If we could free them, their combined will might be strong enough to turn the binding inward instead of outward, to trap the entity permanently instead of releasing it. Edmund looked toward the structure again, noting how it seemed to shift and writhe like something alive. How do we reach them? We walk, Samuel said, taking Edmund's hand. His touch was cold as winter moonlight. But Doctor, you need to understand, once we enter that place, there's no guarantee any of us will come out unchanged. They began walking across the gray wasteland, and with each step, Edmund felt the weight of centuries pressing down on his consciousness. This realm existed outside normal time, and he could sense the accumulated suffering of every soul the entity had claimed stretching back to its first manifestation in the Salem woods. Tell me about Jeremiah and Ezra, he said as they walked. What really happened that night in 1692? Thomas's expression grew distant. They were just children, like us. Terrified children who watched their mother burn and knew they were next. When the hunters came for them, they hid in the cellar and prayed to anything that would listen. Something answered, Samuel continued. Something that had been waiting in the deep places of the earth since before humans learned to make fire. It offered them a bargain, their lives in exchange for the lives of their descendants. But they thought they were clever, Thomas said bitterly. They accepted the bargain but tried to bind the entity at the same time, thinking they could cheat it of its full payment. Instead, they just prolonged the harvest, Samuel finished. Made it stronger by forcing it to feed slowly over generations instead of taking what it wanted all at once. As they approached the structure, Edmund could see that it was built from some material that looked like crystallized screams. The walls were transparent, and inside he could see hundreds of children, all twins, all holding hands, all staring outward with expressions of infinite sadness. They're still conscious, he breathed. It keeps them aware so it can feed on their emotions as well as their spiritual energy, Samuel explained. Fear tastes sweeter when it's fresh. The entrance to the structure was a doorway that seemed to exist only when viewed from certain angles. As they approached, Edmund could hear the voices of all the trapped children singing in harmony, not the ancient chanting that had filled the house, but something else. Something that sounded almost like hope. They know we're coming, Thomas said. They'd been waiting for someone strong enough to reach them. Edmund stepped through the doorway and immediately felt the weight of the entity's attention focusing on him like the heat from a forge. The thing that had been feeding on the Ashwick bloodline for over a century was vast beyond human comprehension, a presence that filled the space between dimensions with hunger and malice. Foolish physician, it spoke through 1,000 young voices at once. You have delivered yourself to us at the moment of our greatest triumph. Tonight we will break free, and your world will learn what true darkness means. But Edmund was no longer listening to the entity's threats. He was focusing on the children, all those generations of twins who had been torn from life at the moment of their greatest innocence. They stood in perfect formation throughout the crystalline halls, their hands clasped together, their eyes fixed on him with desperate hope. Can you hear me? He called out. We hear you, they responded in unison. We've been waiting for you. Then help me understand, how do we turn this binding inward? How do we trap this thing forever instead of setting it free? The answer came not in words but in shared understanding that flooded his consciousness like revelation. The binding ritual required willing participants. The entity had been using the twins' love for each other as the key to unlock its prison. But that same love, freely given and willingly shared, could also be used to strengthen the chains that held it. We have to die anyway, Samuel said, reading the knowledge in Edmund's expression. But if we die by choice instead of by force, if we willingly sacrifice ourselves to strengthen the binding, it will be trapped forever, Thomas finished. But doctor, you have to carry our choice back to the physical realm. Our bodies in your world have to make the same decision consciously. The entity's roar of rage shook the crystalline structure to its foundations. You cannot. The bargain was made. The debt must be paid. The debt will be paid, Edmund said, finally understanding. But not the way you intended. He reached out and grasped the hands of the nearest pair of twins, feeling their spiritual energy flow through him like electricity. One by one, each pair of children in the vast prison joined the chain, their combined will focusing on a single purpose, to turn their sacrifice from an act of victimization into an act of heroism. The entity fought back, sending waves of terror and despair through the connection, but it was too late. The twins had found their strength in unity, and that strength was being channeled through Edmund back to the physical realm where Samuel and Thomas's bodies lay dying. Go, all the children said together. Carry our choice to them. Let them know they won't die as victims, they'll die as heroes. Edmund felt himself being pulled backward through dimensions, the grey wasteland blurring around him as he raced toward his own body. His last sight of the spiritual realm was the crystalline prison beginning to crack and reform, its walls turning from transparent to opaque as the binding magic reversed itself. He awakened in the library to find Margaret shaking him desperately. "Doctor. Doctor, you have to wake up. The boys, something's happening to the boys." Edmund struggled to his feet, his body weak from the spiritual journey but his mind blazing with purpose. "How long was I unconscious?" "Nearly 6 hours. The sun is setting, and they've stopped moving completely. I think they're dying." Edmund raced upstairs to find Samuel and Thomas lying still in their beds, their breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. But their eyes were open and aware, and when they saw him, they smiled with perfect understanding. "You found them," Samuel whispered. "You found all of them," Thomas added. "Are you ready?" Edmund asked gently. "Are you ready to make the choice that will save everyone?" Both boys nodded without hesitation. "We've been ready since this began. We just needed to know that our deaths would mean something." Edmund took their hands, feeling the spiritual connection that bound them together. But now, instead of being a conduit for the entity's manifestation, that connection had become something else, a willing sacrifice that would transform their deaths from a harvest into a binding. "Together," he said. Together, they agreed. And as the sun set on their third day of suffering, Samuel and Thomas Ashwick closed their eyes for the final time, their hands clasped together across the distance between their rooms, their souls joining willingly with all the twins who had come before them to forge chains that would hold their family's ancient enemy until the end of time itself. The silence that followed was deeper than death. For the first time in 3 days, the house stopped groaning, the walls ceased their weeping, and the temperature returned to something approaching normal. Edmund sat between the 2 rooms, holding the lifeless hands of children he had known for barely 72 hours but had grown to love with the fierce protectiveness of a father. Samuel and Thomas lay peaceful at last, their faces serene in a way they had never achieved while the entity tormented them. Their small chests no longer rose and fell, but somehow their clasped hands remained warm, a final gift from the spiritual realm where their sacrifice had transformed a curse into salvation. "Is it over?" Margaret whispered from the doorway. Edmund checked for pulses he knew he wouldn't find, then gently closed the boy's eyes. "They're free. All of them are free." But even as he spoke, he felt something stirring in the depths of his consciousness, a cold presence that had nothing to do with the November weather. The entity's voice, no longer speaking through the children, whispered directly into his mind with the intimacy of a lover's caress. "Did you think it would be so simple, Doctor? Did you believe that freeing them would come without cost?" Edmund stood slowly, his legs unsteady as the full weight of what he had done began to settle on his shoulders. "The binding is complete. You're trapped forever." "Trapped, yes. But not powerless." The voice grew stronger, more insistent. "I cannot claim the twins anymore, but the ritual has opened pathways between our realms. And you, dear physician, you have been marked by your journey into my domain." "What are you talking about?" Margaret gasped as she saw what Edmund couldn't yet perceive, dark veins spreading beneath his skin like ink in water, visible through his pale flesh as the entity's influence began to take hold. "The price of your heroism," the voice explained with malicious satisfaction. "You touched my realm, breathed its air, felt its power flowing through you. Now you carry a fragment of that realm within your very soul." Edmund looked down at his hands and saw the truth written in his own flesh. The dark veins pulsed with each heartbeat, spreading slowly but inexorably throughout his body. "You cannot destroy what has already taken root inside you," the entity continued. "I may be bound, but through you, I can still touch your world. Through your bloodline, I can still harvest what was promised to me." The horrible understanding crashed over Edmund like a cold wave. "My children. Your future children. Your twins. The voice carried such satisfaction that Edmund felt nausea rise in his throat. The Ashwick line is saved, but the curse has simply found a new family to inhabit. When you marry, when you father children, when twins are born to carry your contaminated blood, they will suffer as the Ashwick children suffered. Margaret reached for him, but Edmund stepped back, his mind reeling with the implications. No. There has to be a way to stop it. There is, the entity whispered. Take your own life now, before the corruption spreads completely. Die childless and alone, and the curse dies with you. Edmund stared at the dark veins spreading up his arms, visible now even in the candlelight. The entity was right, he could feel its presence growing stronger with each passing moment, like a cancer metastasizing through his soul. Or, the voice continued seductively, embrace what you have become. Accept my gift willingly, and I will grant you the same immortality I gave Dr. Whitmore. You could live forever, serving as my herald in the mortal realm. Dr. Whitmore, Margaret breathed. He's been alive for 60 years because of this thing. Edmund closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. He could end his own life and save future generations from the curse he now carried, or he could find some other way to break the chain of spiritual contamination before it could claim new victims. There might be another option, he said slowly. If I can find a way to contain the corruption within myself, to prevent it from passing to any children I might have. Impossible, the entity snarled. What has been bound to your soul cannot be unbound. You are mine now, Doctor, as surely as if you had signed your name in blood. But Edmund was already thinking of the binding symbols he had seen throughout the house, the same patterns that had trapped the entity for over a century. If those symbols could contain something as powerful as the creature that had tormented the Ashwick bloodline, perhaps they could also contain whatever corruption now flowed through his veins. Margaret, he said urgently, I need you to help me carve the binding symbols into my flesh. What? Doctor, that's madness. It's the only way. If I can bind the entity's influence to my physical body instead of my spiritual essence, then it can't pass to my descendants. He pulled out his medical instruments, selecting the sharpest scalpel. The symbols have to be carved deep enough to scar permanently, and they have to cover every major blood vessel. Margaret stared at him in horror. That will leave you disfigured for life. Better disfigured than damned. Edmund began sketching the binding patterns on his arms with a piece of charcoal, copying them exactly as he had seen them carved into the house's foundation. If this works, the corruption will be trapped within these marks, unable to spread beyond my own body. And if it doesn't work? Then I'll have to find the strength to take my own life before I can father children. The entity's voice rose to a shriek of rage as it realized what Edmund was attempting. You cannot. I will not be denied what was promised. But Edmund had already begun the first cut, pressing the scalpel deep into the flesh of his forearm while Margaret held the candle steady. Blood flowed freely as he carved the intricate symbols, each line burning like acid as it severed the spiritual pathways the entity was trying to establish. It's working, he gasped as the dark veins in his arm began to fade. The binding is containing the corruption. He continued carving, working his way up both arms and across his chest, each symbol a new prison for the entity's influence. Margaret helped when his hands shook too badly to maintain precision, her tears falling onto the bloody patterns as she assisted in his self-mutilation. Hours passed before the work was complete. Edmund's body was covered in scars that formed an intricate network of binding symbols, each one pulsing with a faint light that seemed to come from another dimension entirely. How do you feel? Margaret asked as she bandaged the worst of the wounds. Edmund tested his spiritual senses, searching for any trace of the entity's presence in his consciousness. The corruption was still there, but it felt contained now, trapped within the scarred patterns on his skin like a spider caught in an amber web. It's bound, he said with exhaustion. I can feel it trying to escape, but the symbols are holding. For how long? That was the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I don't know. Maybe forever, if I'm careful never to damage the scars. Maybe only until the day I die. The entity's voice, much weaker now but still present, whispered one final threat: "You have won this battle, Doctor, but the war continues. Someday, somehow, I will find a way to claim what was promised to me. And when that day comes, your descendants will pay the price for your defiance." Edmund looked at Samuel and Thomas, their peaceful faces a reminder of why he had accepted this burden. "Then I'll spend whatever years I have left making sure that day never comes." As dawn broke over the Ashwick estate, Margaret helped Edmund bury the boys in the family cemetery, their coffins placed side by side so they could rest together as they had died. The house stood silent and empty, its supernatural manifestations finally ended, but the scars on Edmund's body would serve as a permanent reminder of the price paid for their salvation. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked as they stood beside the fresh graves. Edmund pulled his coat tight around his scarred chest, feeling the binding symbols pulse with each heartbeat. "I'll return to my practice. I'll help people heal, as I always have. But I'll never marry, never have children, never take the risk that this curse might find a way to spread despite the bindings. That's no life for a young man. It's the life I chose when I entered this house 3 days ago." Edmund picked up his medical bag, the same leather satchel he had carried when he first answered Margaret's desperate summons. "And it's a small price to pay for the knowledge that the Ashwick twins, all of them, are finally at peace." As he walked away from the estate, Edmund felt the entity stirring restlessly within its new prison of scarred flesh. The battle was won, but the war against the forces that preyed on innocent children would continue for as long as he drew breath. Behind him, Margaret stood alone among the graves of her family, finally free from a curse that had claimed 7 generations of twins. The price of that freedom was a doctor's willingness to carry the darkness within himself, ensuring that it could never again reach out to claim the children he had sworn to protect. But in the deepest parts of his soul, where the binding symbols could not quite reach, Edmund wondered how long his scarred flesh would be strong enough to contain the ancient hunger that now called his body home. 21 years passed like pages torn from a calendar by an impatient wind. Dr. Edmund Holloway had kept his word, living as a bachelor physician whose dedication to healing had become legend throughout Maine. The scars that covered his body had faded to pale silver lines, but they still pulsed with otherworldly light whenever he examined them in the mirror, a constant reminder of the darkness contained within his flesh. He had convinced himself that the binding would hold forever. Until the morning when the letter arrived. Edmund's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal, recognizing his wife's handwriting despite the desperation that made her usually elegant script appear rushed and frantic. Wife, a word that should not have existed in his vocabulary, but 5 years ago, loneliness had finally overwhelmed caution. Maria had been a widow with no family history of twins, and Edmund had convinced himself that the risk was minimal. He had been catastrophically wrong. "My dearest Edmund," the letter began, "I pray this reaches you before it is too late. Jonathan and Michael have fallen ill with symptoms that defy all medical explanation. They collapsed simultaneously yesterday while playing in separate rooms, and now they lie unconscious, their bodies convulsing in perfect synchronization every 13 minutes. Dear husband, I fear the curse you told me about in our darkest hour has found us despite all your precautions." Edmund's medical bag hit the floor as his legs gave out beneath him. The binding symbols across his chest began to burn with the intensity of fresh wounds, and he could feel the entity stirring within its prison of scarred flesh like a snake awakening from hibernation. "Did you think 21 years would be enough, doctor?" The voice whispered through his consciousness with malicious satisfaction. "Did you believe your pathetic binding would hold forever?" "No," Edmund breathed, staggering to his feet. "The symbols are still intact. The corruption is still contained. The corruption is still contained, yes. But corruption breeds corruption, my dear physician. Your children carry your blood, and your blood carries the memory of my realm. They were always mine, you simply delayed the inevitable. Edmund raced to his study and pulled out every text on demonic binding he had collected over the past 2 decades. There had to be a way to transfer the curse back to himself, to spare Jonathan and Michael the fate that awaited twin children touched by the entity's influence. I'll find a way to stop this, he vowed. Will you? The same way you stopped me before. The entity's laughter filled his mind like acid. You saved the Ashwick twins by allowing them to choose sacrifice over victimization. But your sons are only 5 years old, Doctor. Too young to understand choice, too innocent to willingly give their lives for a greater good. The truth hit Edmund like a physical blow. Samuel and Thomas had been 7 when the curse claimed them, old enough to comprehend the meaning of their sacrifice. But Jonathan and Michael were barely more than babies, incapable of making the conscious choice that had transformed the previous ritual from harvest to binding. Their deaths will feed me as the Ashwick deaths were meant to, the entity continued. And this time, there will be no heroic sacrifice to transform my feast into a prison. This time, I will finally break free to claim what has been denied me for too long. Edmund's carriage had never moved fast enough as he raced toward home, the miles stretching endlessly before him while the binding symbols on his body grew hotter with each passing moment. The entity was growing stronger as Jonathan and Michael weakened, drawing power from their synchronized suffering just as it had with generations of Ashwick twins. His house came into view just as the sun reached its zenith, and Edmund could see immediately that something was wrong. The windows were dark despite the midday light, and shadows moved behind the glass in patterns that defied the laws of nature. Maria met him at the door, her face haggard with exhaustion and terror. Edmund, thank God you're here. They've been getting worse by the hour. He followed her upstairs to find his sons lying in separate beds, their small bodies rigid with the same catatonic symptoms that had claimed Samuel and Thomas. But these children were so much younger, so much more fragile, and Edmund could see that they wouldn't survive the 3 days of torment that had preceded the Ashwick twins' deaths. How long since the last convulsion? He asked, checking his pocket watch. 3 minutes ago. Edmund, what's happening to them? What curse did you bring into our home? Before he could answer, both boys began speaking in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that belonged to something infinitely ancient and hungry. Hello, Doctor. Welcome home. Edmund felt his scarred chest burning as the entity's presence pressed against its bindings. Let them go. Your quarrel is with me. My quarrel is with the promise that was broken, both children replied. The Ashwick line owed me 7 generations of twins, and you robbed me of my final harvest. Your sons will pay that debt. They're not old enough to make the choice that Samuel and Thomas made. Precisely. The boys' simultaneous smile was terrible to behold. Which means their deaths will feed me instead of binding me. And with that strength, I will finally shatter these pathetic scars you've wrapped around my essence. Edmund felt the binding symbols beginning to crack under the entity's renewed assault. 21 years of containment were unraveling as the creature drew power from his son's suffering. There has to be another way, he said desperately. There is, both boys said in unison. Take their place. What? Offer yourself as willing sacrifice. Let me feed on your adult consciousness instead of their innocent souls. Your death will not bind me as the twins' deaths could have, but it will satisfy the debt owed by your contaminated bloodline. Maria gasped as she finally understood the full scope of what Edmund had brought into their lives. You're talking about my husband killing himself to save our children? I'm talking about the only choice that leads to their survival, the entity replied through Jonathan and Michael's mouths. Edmund's willing death in exchange for the boy's freedom. The curse passes to him and dies with him, leaving your sons free to live normal lives. Edmund looked at his wife's desperate face, then at his sons lying helpless under the entity's influence. The choice was no choice at all. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "you swear they'll be released? No lingering influence, no future claims on their bloodline?" "I swear by the ancient pacts that bind all such bargains. Their souls will be cleansed the moment your heart stops beating." Edmund pulled out his medical instruments, selecting a scalpel with the same steady hands that had saved countless lives over the years. "Maria, take the boys and leave the house. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "Edmund, no. There has to be another way." "There isn't." He kissed her forehead gently, tasting the salt of her tears. "Tell them I love them enough to die for them. Tell them their father kept his promise to protect them from the darkness." As Maria carried their unconscious sons from the house, Edmund stood alone in the room where he had planned to watch them grow up. The entity's presence pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight, hungry and eager for the feast he was about to provide. "Are you ready, Doctor?" "I've been ready since the day I first entered the Ashwick estate," Edmund replied, raising the scalpel to his throat. "I always knew this moment would come." "Then complete the bargain. Willingly give your life, and your sons will be free." Edmund thought of Samuel and Thomas, of their courage in choosing sacrifice over victimization. His sons would never know how close they had come to sharing that fate, but they would live to see adulthood, to marry and have children of their own without fear of curses or supernatural predators. The scalpel was sharp and his hand was steady. The cut was deep and precise, severing the carotid artery with the skill of a physician who knew exactly how to ensure death would come quickly. As his blood spilled onto the floor, Edmund felt the entity's satisfaction flooding through their connection. But he also felt something else, the binding symbols on his chest blazing with sudden, unexpected power. "What?" the entity snarled. "What is this?" Edmund smiled as understanding dawned in his fading consciousness. "A willing sacrifice by one who has been marked by your realm. You thought you were feeding on my death, but you've actually triggered the same binding magic that trapped you before." The scars on his body erupted with light as his life force poured out, not to feed the entity but to strengthen the spiritual chains that held it. His willing death was transforming the corruption in his blood into something else, a final lock on the prison that had contained the creature for over a century. "You cannot," the entity shrieked. "I am so close to freedom." "You will never be free," Edmund whispered as darkness closed around him. "My death seals you forever, and my sons will grow up in a world where their children's children will never know your touch." Dr. Edmund Holloway died as the sun set on his 48th birthday, his blood forming patterns on the floor that matched the binding symbols carved into his scarred flesh. The entity's screams of rage faded into silence as the spiritual prison locked permanently around its essence, the key thrown away by a father's ultimate sacrifice. Miles away, Jonathan and Michael Holloway opened their eyes for the first time in 2 days, their young faces peaceful and unmarked by the supernatural torment that had nearly claimed them. They would grow up with no memory of their brief encounter with forces beyond human comprehension, free to live and love and raise families of their own. But sometimes, late at night when the wind blew cold through the Maine woods, children in the surrounding villages would wake to the sound of distant laughter, not the malicious cackle of something ancient and hungry, but the warm, protective laughter of a father watching over his sons from whatever realm awaits those who willingly give their lives for love. The curse was broken, the entity bound forever, and the eternal cycle of sacrifice and salvation had finally found its end in the courage of a man who chose to die so that others might live. If you've stayed with this dark tale to its bitter end, comment, "The curse never dies, it only changes hands."